Hi, my name is M.A. Shambak. I want to ask a question today. Where did Islam begin? Did Islam begin in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, or it began in Petra, southern Jordan? Now, for many hearing this question, it will sound ridiculous for somebody to ask where did Islam begin, because everybody knows that will be the saying that Islam began in Mecca. But no, the stones disagree with the standard Islamic narrative. When I talk about the stones, I'm talking about archaeological discoveries. What do I mean by that? You see, according to the standard Islamic narrative, Islam began in Mecca. And what I'm going to say is basic knowledge that Muhammad was meditating in Mecca, in a mountain, where he had an encounter with a being. This is like an ABCD of trying to study Islam. And he was not comfortable with this being that he had seen. He thought he had seen a demon, a Satan. He felt suicidal, and then he had to tell the wife. But it took the wife, Khadija, to convince him that no, what you are seeing is not a demon, but it's an angel. But if you need further confirmation, I will take you to my cousin Waraq ibn Nawfal, who was more knowledgeable. He was a Christian, a Nestorian Christian, perhaps a scholar. He would be able to convince you further. Waraq ibn Nawfal then convinces Muhammad, no, you are a prophet of Allah. And then Muhammad eventually assumed this prophethood, began to preach to his own Qurayshi tribe. He was rejected, and then he fled from Mecca to Medina, known as Hijrah, and that was the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Now, before he left, he had received revelations, surahs that became known as the Quran from this supposedly angel Gabriel. And also in Medina, he became successful as a political leader and as a religious leader, as a prophet of Allah, where he also received surahs. So he had surahs from both Medina and Mecca that became known as the Quran, compiled into 144 chapters. So he came back to Mecca, became successful, final prophet of Allah, died, and then the Islamic religion began to expand. That is the standard Islamic narrative. Now, here's the critical question. How did we get this information? Because we need to know. We need to know how we got this information. Not from the first 100 years of Islam. From the first 100 years of Islam, there's absolutely nothing. From the second 200 years of Islam, there's absolutely nothing. So we are talking about 2 centuries with no information, with no document, no manuscript on all of this information. The information I just narrated to you came 200 years after Islam. How did that happen? Because writing had predated Islam. Writing can be traced hundreds, if not centuries or millennia, way back to the Sumers in Babylon, known as the Sumerians. They had a writing style known as cuneiform, where they produced stories of how the world began, a war that began with Marduk and Tiamat, and how Marduk was able to rally all the gods and they fought against Tiamat, divided Tiamat into 2. The upper part of Tiamat became the clouds, the lower part of Tiamat became, the earth's surface. From there, we also got to read about the Enuma Elish and all of that. So writing predated that. We had writing from the era of Hammurabi, who even predated Moses, and then Moses also came out with the Old Testament writings, and so during the era of Muhammad, even the biblical, the New Testament manuscripts were in circulation, so writings was available. So how come for the first 200 years of Islam there is absolutely silence? There was a medieval discovery in Timbuktu in Mali of a library that contained over 700 manuscripts, 700,000 manuscripts, ancient writings of Islamic traditions, scriptures and recitations and all of that. None of them from the first 200 years. So the information, the standard Islamic narrative, only emerged or began to emerge 200 years after Islam from a man known as Ibn Shem, because the works of Ibn Ishaq that came 165 years after Islam were even missing. So Ibn Shem from Basra, not from Mecca, not from Medina, 216 in the Islamic calendar AH, he began to write some of this information known as the Sirat. Then also after him, you had about 15 years later, you had Abdullah ibn Habal, and then also about 15 years, you had Sahih al-Bukhari. He compiled over 600,000 manuscripts, decided to narrow them down to about 7,000. Where is he from? Uzbekistan. And then you also had a student. He had a student known as Sahih Muslim or Imam Muslim, because Sahih simply means the authentic one. So Sahih Muslim from where? From Iran. Also wrote about Islam and the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. Then you also had the likes of Sunnah Abu Dawood from where? Iran. You had Ibn Taymiyyah from where? Iran. You had Al-Tabari from where? Afghanistan, Iran, a region between Afghanistan, Iran. So when you look at all the writings, the narrative, the manuscripts of early Islam, none of the writers came from Mecca, came from Medina. They all came from regions far from Medina. But you see, we know from the Quran, Surah chapter 2, verses 144, Surah to Bakar, that Muhammad received a revelation when he was praying and the direction was facing towards Sham. And according to the tafsir, the commentaries, he was facing Jerusalem. He received a revelation that he should turn towards Masjid al-Haram, the mosque, the sacred mosque. So he turned towards the sacred direction, Masjid al-Haram. And according to Islamic commentaries, we know from tafsir, we know that this happened in the 16th month of the Hijrah. So this is less than 2 years into the Hijrah. So we are expecting, that was when Muhammad received the direction that he should start facing Mecca to pray. He was in Medina. So we are therefore expecting that all the qibla simply means the direction, the sacred direction of prayer, all qiblas should face Mecca. Because as a Muslim, you just don't build a mosque and say, well, I want the mosque to face anywhere I want, north, east, south, west. No, it doesn't work that way. It has to face Mecca. And even if you want to sacrifice an animal, meat for food, and you want it to be acceptable, you have to face Mecca. But here's what happened. There was an archaeological discovery done by archaeologist Dan Gibson with his team. They took a little over a decade to examine over 200 mosques in the first 300 years of Islam. They wanted to determine the qiblas, the direction of prayer. The direction of prayer. This was what they discovered, and I will not have all the details today. What they discovered was that from the first Hijrah to 130 years into the Islamic calendar, they had mosques facing Petra. Petra is found in southern Jordan. How come? Because the mosque should be facing Mecca. But from the beginning of Hijrah to 130 years into the Islamic calendar, you had mosques. Out of the 200 mosques that they had examined, you had mosques facing Petra. In fact, the first mosque facing Petra was in Massawa. Now, these are people who were assumed to have fled the Hijrah together with Muhammad, but they were on their way to Abyssinia, but they stopped at Massawa and built a mosque, but the direction was facing Petra, not Mecca. They were mosques built by early Islamic soldiers in Iraq, in Spain, in part of Africa, Egypt, facing Petra, not Mecca. Qiblah's direction, prayer. And just in case someone will say, well, these people were not that enlightened to determine cardinal position, wrong. They had a technology known as Indian cycle, where they could determine cardinal positioning. And Dan Gibson, together with his team of scholars, were able to use global positioning system known as GPS to determine all of this. And the first time a mosque, a qibla of a mosque, the direction was facing Mecca, the first mosque was built in 88 AH. That is 88 years into the Islamic calendar. That was when they discovered the mosque that was facing Mecca. 88 years into the Islamic calendar. This is over 60 years after Muhammad had died. That was when a mosque was now facing Mecca. For 88 years, all mosques were facing Petra, not Mecca. I'm not just assuming something. These are documented and written in books by the likes of Dan Gibson, collaborated by other archaeological scholars. Now here's what is interesting, because Muhammad is supposed to have been succeeded by Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr was succeeded by Umar, and Umar was succeeded by Uthman. Now Uthman was succeeded by Ali, but Uthman was killed. Now where was the headquarters of Ali? Because Ali is supposed to be a caliphate. His headquarters was in Kufa, Iraq. And there are archaeological evidence that his headquarters was in Iraq. There is no archaeological evidence of Muhammad in Mecca, of Abu Bakr, of Uthman in Mecca, no archaeological evidence. And I have challenged ChatGPT in a debate because ChatGPT is the finest Islamic apologist. I'm telling you that whoever designed ChatGPT, they've made it to be the finest Islamic apologist. And I debated with it for over an hour, texting within my phone. And if you are quite illiterate, it will try to get away with certain things until you begin to actually face it with hardcore evidence. The only archaeological evidence began with Ali. Ali is supposed to be an in-law of Muhammad, and from the Ali we had the Shiites, and that was when the whole issue of the Shiite and the Sunnis came about. I'm trying to summarize this video not to make it long and proceed later. Now, his headquarters was in Iraq. Now, he was eventually killed, and that was when we had the first civil war. Now, when he was killed, you had Muawiyah succeeding him, and Muawiyah began what became known as the Umayyad Caliph, after him, he was succeeded by his son Yazid. Yazid was succeeded by Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik was succeeded by Al-Walid. They began what became known as the Umayyad Caliphate, where he was succeeded by his sons. All the mosques that they built before the second civil war of Islam were facing Petra, not Mecca. When Abdul Malik built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is in Jerusalem today, and it was completed by his son Caliphate Al-Walid, it is facing Petra, not Mecca. Why? Why were all their mosques facing Petra, not Mecca? Because the Prophet of Islam was in Petra. He wasn't in Mecca. I'm going to go into details in my next video, and I'll be talking about the Kaaba, where the Kaaba originally was located. You see, all of this is for you to know that Jesus is the King of Kings, the Alpha and the Omega. It's my prayer that you will give your life to Jesus. God bless you.